What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
The room smelled like money, like polished oak and champagne foam, and that perfume older women wear when they want to remind you they never settled. Everything about the venue screamed legacy, from the string quartet lazily bowing out a Sinatra medley in the corner to the brand-new velvet drapes that were probably dry-cleaned before they were even hung. And, somewhere under all that gloss, I stood at the edge of the room with a warm flute in my hand and a cold smirk hiding behind it, wondering how many people here knew the real reason this party was happening at all. It was my mother's retirement party, Patricia Keller's grand finale. 40 years in finance. Headlines. Board seats. Books no one read, but everyone displayed. People talked about her like she'd invented compound interest, like every building with her name on it had been carved out of stone with her bare hands. But no one in this room knew her the way I did. No one here had ever been told, at 13, that being emotional was why women didn't lead companies. No one here had heard her say, without blinking, if you marry for love, I'll be damned if I pay for the wedding. That was my mother's love language: control. Power. Her affection was a pie chart, and if you didn't bring ROI, you didn't make the slice. I hadn't planned to come tonight. I'd RSVP'd no. Twice. But something in me wanted to see it. The moment she handed the keys to someone else, the moment her grip on everything she built loosened just enough for a crack to show. Maybe it was petty. Maybe it was stupid. But I wanted to see if she'd still wear that same glassy smile when she wasn't the one writing everyone's checks. And I was curious, deeply, maybe morbidly curious, about what she'd say in her speech, because if you knew my mother, you knew one thing for sure: Patricia never ended anything quietly. At 7:38, right on cue, the MC gave the signal, and the pianist shifted from cocktail jazz to something more formal. The lights dimmed a little. I saw my brother, Mark, grinning in the front row like the second coming of Gordon Gekko. His suit looked tailored, probably one of those pieces he'd borrowed from Mom's black card without asking. Beside him sat Emily, the youngest, the one who used to cry when Mom ignored her school plays, but who now wore that same dismissive smirk. Somewhere between those school plays and this party, Emily had decided it was easier to become Patricia's mirror than her disappointment. I'd chosen differently. And that's why, at most family dinners, there was always one chair too many. Then she took the mic. Her hair was perfect silver, sharp, every strand placed like a weapon. Her dress looked like something they custom tailor for women who sue people for sport. She smiled at the crowd like she owned every square inch of them. And maybe she did. Tonight, she said, her voice steady and commanding in that practiced, boardroom tone that didn't care if you liked her, we celebrate not just my retirement, but the legacy of Keller Financial and the people who helped build it. There was a gentle, reverent clap. She paused long enough to sip from a glass handed to her by someone I didn't recognize, probably a new assistant, one she hadn't chewed through yet. I've been blessed, she continued, to have colleagues who became friends, clients who became partners, and a family who, well, challenged me to be better. That line got a few polite chuckles, the kind that say, she's tough, but she's earned it. She looked over the crowd slowly, and I swear to God, I saw it before she even said it. That shift in her eyes. The moment she stopped performing for the room and started aiming the next sentence like a sniper. And as I step away, it's time to talk about the future. My estate. My legacy. The next chapter. The air in the room froze for a second. It was subtle, the way people leaned in, even while pretending not to. Because everyone here, especially the ones with blood ties or long histories with her firm, was thinking the same thing: how much of the pie is mine? Patricia smiled. It wasn't warm. Some of you, she said, pausing for emphasis, will be set for life. Others won't be getting a dime. Laughter. Nervous, half-hearted, confused. I didn't laugh. Not because I didn't expect it, I did, but because I knew what was coming next. She turned her head slowly until her gaze locked on mine. Right through the crowd. Past the wine and the whispers. Right at me. I felt the heads turn. Just a few, but enough. I could hear someone behind me say my name in a low whisper like I'd been caught sneaking into a funeral. I raised my glass in her direction, smiling just wide enough to look amused. She didn't blink. And that's when I said it. That's fine. I bought the company that paid for this venue. For a moment, the room didn't react. They didn't know whether I was joking, bluffing, or insane. But my mother did. Her jaw didn't drop. Her eyes didn't widen. No, Patricia was a master of stillness. But the corner of her mouth pulled in, just slightly, like someone had yanked a thread in a very expensive tapestry. Mark stood up so fast he knocked over a chair. Emily's face went pale. The MC stuttered something into the mic before stepping back like he didn't want to be anywhere near what was coming next. I took one last sip of champagne, let the silence breathe for another second, then leaned in just enough for my voice to carry to the front row. You're welcome, by the way. Hope the caviar was worth it. And I walked out, not rushed, not dramatic, just done. But let me tell you something. That moment, that silence, it wasn't revenge. It wasn't even the final move. It was the introduction. Because if there's one thing my mother taught me, whether she meant to or not, it's that power isn't about having the last word. It's about making sure the words echo long after you're gone. And mine were just getting started. The truth is, no matter how old you are, no matter how far you've traveled, how many doors you've opened on your own, or how many times you've slammed them shut, there's a particular kind of wound that only your mother can carve into you, slow, deliberate, and almost elegant in how clean it looks from the outside, so neat that even you begin to question whether it was ever bleeding in the first place. When I stood at that party and watched my mother pretend, for the benefit of 100 sycophants and former employees, that she had the luxury of deciding which of her children were worthy of a future and which weren't even worth the oxygen in the room. It didn't come as a surprise to me, it came as confirmation. Not of how little she thought of me, that had been clear for years, but of how certain she was that I'd never amount to more than the awkward footnote in her otherwise pristine legacy. But it didn't start there, at some luxury venue in Manhattan with crystal glasses and legacy funds pouring in like rows. It started decades ago, in a kitchen where nothing was ever warm except the stove. The kind of kitchen where compliments were doled out like performance bonuses, after measurable results, and never without a reminder that next year's numbers mattered more. I remember sitting at the chipped counter, watching my brother Mark walk in with his SAT scores, not perfect, but close enough that my mother's face shifted in a way I'd only seen when she was shaking hands with a powerful man, that soft smile that said, "You're proving me right." She poured him fresh squeezed orange juice that morning, the kind she said she never had time to make, and I watched him drink it like it belonged to him. I remember asking if she'd look at my art project after breakfast, a full-scale model of the Lincoln Memorial I'd spent days on, complete with marble-painted columns made from paper. Towel rolls, and I remember the way she didn't even turn her head when she said, "That's not going to get you into Yale." Mark was the golden child, not just favored, but burnished, displayed, polished by her approval and protected by the unspoken understanding that his future was an extension of hers. Every family has one, but in ours, the distinction wasn't subtle. It was architectural, built into the structure of our lives, into who got the front seat, who got the last word, and who got asked, even at 12, whether she really thought dressing like that would make people take her seriously. It wasn't about discipline, not really, because she didn't care about obedience unless it looked like ambition. It was about control. And Mark made it easy. He never questioned her, never challenged her, and never once told her that the way she spoke to people felt like a scalpel disguised as strategy. He didn't need to rebel, because everything he wanted, validation, money, status, was already waiting for him at the end of whatever path she paved. I, on the other hand, was the question mark, the one who asked why she worked so late if she never smiled when she came home, the one who wondered out loud why Dad had moved out but still sent flowers on her birthday. The one who noticed that she never once hung our school photos on the fridge because they didn't match the aesthetic. And I didn't just ask questions, I asked them with a kind of tone that implied I expected an honest answer, which, to my mother, was the greatest insult of all. She could handle defiance, maybe even laziness, but what she couldn't tolerate was exposure, the idea that someone, even a daughter, might be looking too closely at the seams she'd spent her whole life trying to hide. I wasn't dumb. I knew early on that nothing I did was going to shift her compass. So I stopped trying to be seen and started trying to win elsewhere. I took summer jobs at bookstores and ice cream shops just to earn my own cash, because I didn't want her to say my success was bought with her money. I graduated early from high school, not because I wanted to prove a point, but because staying in that house another year felt like drowning slowly. I got into NYU without her help, took out loans, worked nights tutoring rich kids who drove better cars than my professors, and still managed to finish top 5 in my class. And when I emailed her the news, I got a reply that simply said, "Well, you made your bed. Hope it's comfortable." She never visited me at college. Not once. Didn't come to graduation, didn't send a card. But she flew to Boston to see Mark speak at a conference and sent me a photo of them together on the harbor with a note that read, "Saw your old campus from the plane. You should have gone to Harvard." It's funny. People think the worst thing a parent can do is scream, punish, ground, spank, whatever. But the worst thing, the one that sticks in your bones and shows up in your reflection at 38, is when a parent actively chooses to ignore your wins, to pretend they don't exist. That silence isn't empty. It's surgical. It removes something essential, like the belief that love is ever unconditional. By the time I was 25, I had already started laying the groundwork for the company that would eventually become my way out. Not out of poverty, because she made sure we had everything but emotional stability, but out of her shadow. I registered the first LLC under a different name, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to build something that no one could take credit for but me. I worked with people she'd never meet. I made moves she'd never see. And I kept every single receipt. The world my mother lived in was built on visibility, awards, interviews, plaques, Forbes articles, charity galas. But the world I was building didn't need lights or applause. It needed leverage. And I was quietly learning how to acquire it. There's a memory that still shows up sometimes, especially in moments when I doubt myself, which, yes, still happens. I'm 16. I'm standing in the hallway outside her office, waiting to ask if I can borrow the car to go to a summer internship interview. She's on the phone with someone, a colleague, maybe a board member. And I hear her laugh, sharp, not fake, but definitely performative, and then say, "Jordan's smart," but she's the kind of smart that makes people uncomfortable. She'll end up working for someone like Mark one day, if she's lucky. She didn't say it to hurt me. She didn't know I was there. That's what made it worse. That's when I knew. Not that she didn't love me, I'd already accepted that. But that she didn't respect me. That she had already decided my value before I even had the chance to prove her wrong. And that, more than anything, was what lit the fire I never let go out. Because respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you take. And I was just getting started. There's a kind of revenge that doesn't look like rage, doesn't sound like screaming, and doesn't feel like victory, at least not right away. It's the kind that simmers quietly beneath the surface for years, growing cold and sharp and methodical, feeding on every slight, every comment laced with superiority, every moment of being dismissed by the people who were supposed to lift you. That's the kind I learned to cultivate, not because I was born vengeful or bitter, but because I was left with no other option but to turn the silence they fed me into something with weight, with muscle, with teeth. While my siblings played house in the legacy our mother built, sitting on mockboards and inflating their own sense of worth by using her name like a skeleton key to every locked room, I was quietly watching, listening, and learning. Not out of spite. Not at first. But because I knew that if I didn't build something entirely mine, I would spend the rest of my life being told I hadn't earned a single thing. I started in the shadows, exactly where she assumed I belonged, not because I lacked ambition, but because I understood something my mother had never had the humility to learn. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't ask permission. It waits, studies, and strikes only when the opponent has grown arrogant enough to stop looking over their shoulder. The first move was a small firm in Connecticut, an underdog in the corporate consulting world, overlooked but stable, with a team of analysts more interested in data than dinner parties. I joined under a different name, using the last name of my grandmother, the only person in my family who ever told me I didn't have to act smaller to be accepted. I didn't tell anyone who I was related to, or where I came from. I just worked. And as I worked, I took notes about how small companies were being bought, gutted, repackaged. About how people with quiet influence made moves that didn't make headlines until they did. That's when I found the iceberg. Most people know Keller Financial, my mother's company, for its visible success. Awards, articles, philanthropy. But I had access to something deeper. The whispers in industry forums, the footnotes in acquisition agreements, the inconsistencies in public filings that most people overlook because they assume that anything operating on that level has already been audited and cleared. But I knew better. I knew that my mother had built her kingdom not on clean stone, but on the kind of clever theft that passes for strategy in rooms full of rich men. She didn't just start Keller Financial. She stole it. Not the paperwork, not the bank accounts, but the intellectual foundation, the entire core concept from a junior partner named Henry Alcott. He was a soft-spoken analyst with ideas ahead of his time, who trusted her mentorship, who gave her access to every pitch deck and prototype, and who was slowly pushed out once the firm took off. She buried him under ironclad NDAs and a non-compete clause that should have never been legal, but by the time he realized what had happened, she was already being profiled in Forbes, and he had already signed away his life's work. I found him by accident, or maybe fate, working as a private consultant in Vermont, divorced, quiet, and still writing code for financial algorithms that would have made Silicon Valley blush. He didn't recognize me at first. My last name, my posture, maybe even my voice had changed too much. But once I told him who I was and why I'd come, he looked at me for a long moment before finally saying, "She told me once that her kids would either worship her or disappear." I guess he chose door number 3. He agreed to work with me, not out of vengeance, but because I promised him something my mother never did: transparency and credit. Together, we started developing a series of proprietary models that predicted market fluctuations more accurately than anything being used in the major firms, including Keller Financial. And I wasn't just building tools. I was building leverage. Every insight we gathered, every firm we advised, every client we quietly took from under their nose was another brick in the wall between me and the cage my mother tried to keep me in. Eventually, the money started flowing in, slowly at first, then like a storm surge, private equity groups, high net worth individuals, foreign partners, and I reinvested every dollar. Not into yachts or fashion or anything flashy. I bought shares. I bought silence. I bought proximity. Because my goal was never to become rich in the way my mother defined it. I didn't want a plaque or a statue or a damn retirement party. I wanted a seat at the table she never thought I was good enough to enter, and I wanted to be the one who controlled the conversation once I got there. That's when I made the move. Keller Financial, like most aging firms, had begun to split off pieces of its operation, licensing divisions, divesting underperforming arms, selling office space. It was a slow dismantling, done under the guise of strategic pivoting, but I saw what it really was: my mother cashing out before the tides turned, because even she could see the market was shifting and her empire wasn't agile enough to keep up. One of those spin-offs, a real estate arm tied to corporate event spaces and conference venues, ended up in the hands of a private equity group that didn't realize what they were sitting on. But I did. So I bought into the group, anonymously, quietly, through a series of intermediaries. And within a year, I had enough voting power to dictate their investment strategies. I waited. I watched. And when I found out that the venue my mother had already booked for her retirement gala was owned by the same group, I knew the moment had finally arrived, not for revenge, but for reveal. Because it wasn't just about the party. It wasn't about humiliating her. It was about reminding everyone, including myself, that just because you weren't given the keys to the castle doesn't mean you can't build your own damn kingdom out of bricks they didn't even notice were missing. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends, not my colleagues, not even Henry. I wanted the moment to speak for itself. I wanted her to feel, just for 1 second, what I had felt every day growing up, the quiet burn of realizing that someone you underestimated had just passed you without ever needing your permission. That's the thing about icebergs. They always look small from the surface. But the real weight, the part that sinks ships, is the part you never see coming. and she didn't see me coming. Not even close. Some people think revenge is loud, theatrical, a grand, sweeping act of retaliation served in front of an audience desperate for blood, like a courtroom confession or a dramatic meltdown on a rainy front porch. But those people have never truly been humiliated in silence, haven't felt the dull, insidious sting of being disregarded over the span of decades by someone who claimed to love them while carving out space for every other person in the room except you. The kind of revenge I chose, the only kind that ever felt worth the price, wasn't about spectacle, and it wasn't about breaking her. It was about building something unshakable beneath her feet until the ground gave way and she realized, too late, that everything she thought she controlled had already been compromised by the one person she never even bothered to watch. It had been nearly 10 years since I stopped trying to gain her approval, 10 long, methodical years during which I refused to let my pain rot me from the inside, and instead converted every insult, every dismissal, every closed-door conversation I was left out of into strategy, not revenge fantasies or bitter daydreams, but real, tangible strategy built on research, relationships, and cold calculation. While my mother floated further into her legacy with the air of a monarch distributing inheritances to loyal subjects, signing checks with the kind of performative grace that made people believe they were lucky just to be near her, I was learning how to infiltrate the very systems she believed she owned, not by forcing my way in or kicking down doors like some rebel with a chip on her shoulder, but by quietly becoming indispensable in places she had stopped paying attention to. I had spent the last several years acquiring pieces, not just of companies, but of reputations, of connections, of the soft power that doesn't show up on balance sheets, but decides them anyway. The venue group I'd bought into was only the first domino. From there, I started acquiring microshares in investment firms that held stakes in Keller Financial's client base. Not enough to spook anyone. Not enough to make headlines. But enough to matter. I wasn't trying to destroy her company. That would have been easy and, frankly, too merciful. I was trying to rewrite the way her empire operated, brick by brick, from the inside out. And no one, not the board, not her bloated, overly paid executive team, and certainly not her children, had the faintest clue that the woman they thought had been banished to the outskirts of the family was now sitting at the table with all the real power. I received the email about the retirement gala 6 months before the event, forwarded to me by a colleague who thought I'd find it amusing. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me, that the same woman who had once looked me dead in the face and told me that resentment is for people with no upward mobility, was now planning a lavish exit celebration in a building partially financed by my own company's capital. I didn't tell him why I laughed when I read it, just said, "Looks like they went with one of our premium packages," and moved on with my day. Because that's what you do when you've already won. You smile, you nod, and you wait for the rest of the world to catch up. But the part that stung, even then, the part one hadn't anticipated, was that despite all of it, despite the leverage, the control, the triumph of knowing I'd built something bigger than her approval could ever offer, there was still a part of me, buried somewhere deep and unwilling to die, that hoped she might look back one day and see me not as a mistake or a problem or an ungrateful daughter, but as an equal, maybe even as someone to be proud of. I didn't expect her to apologize, but I think I wanted her to notice. And when I realized she never would, that she would go to her grave believing she'd outsmarted the very daughter who'd bankrolled her farewell party, something in me hardened permanently. So I crafted my moment. Not a speech. Not a confrontation. Just a line. One simple truth delivered like a scalpel, clean, sharp, and bloodless. But before that moment could come, I needed to secure the final piece, the one move that would cement everything. A month before the gala, I initiated a silent acquisition of a minority holding in one of Keller Financial's strategic consulting partners, a firm responsible for guiding their mid-tier investments and tax strategies. I knew the CEO, a man who once told me at a conference that I was wasting my intellect in a boutique firm, not realizing that I owned half the floor we were standing on. Through a holding company based out of Delaware, I bought into his firm with the kind of quiet aggression that makes people uneasy without ever giving them a reason to question your intent. By the time the ink dried, I had access to all their data, the reports they sent to Keller, the projections they were too cautious to put in writing, and the recommendations that had been made regarding asset liquidation and future viability. I read them with the cold detachment of someone reading an obituary. Keller Financial was bloated, overleveraged, and losing its grip on the very market segments it had once pioneered. My mother had built her brand on being ahead of the curve, but she had become the curve, predictable, sluggish, and surrounded by people too afraid to tell her she was no longer necessary. The consultants had been urging her to restructure aggressively, but she'd refused, citing legacy integrity and some nonsense about not handing over a company that looked like it was bleeding. She was planning to step down, yes, but not without preserving the illusion of control. And that's where I came in. By the time the event date rolled around, I had already restructured my firm's portfolio to anticipate Keller's eventual destabilization. I had pulled back investments from 2 dependent firms and shifted capital into high-yield assets that would spike when Keller's index dropped. I had also finalized a discreet transition plan with a former Keller board member who'd been quietly seeking an exit and offered him a seat at my table, one he accepted without hesitation. Not because he respected me, but because he respected what I'd built, which, to me, was infinitely more valuable. The night of the party, as I watched her float through the room like she was royalty stepping down from the throne instead of a CEO stepping away from a burning platform, I realized something I hadn't quite expected. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't need her to collapse, to cry, or to beg for my approval. Because I had already taken everything I ever needed from her, not through cruelty or betrayal, but through excellence. Through precision. Through becoming the very thing she had claimed I was too emotional, too disobedient, too unpredictable to become. So when she looked me in the eye and said what she said, that loaded little bomb about who would be set for life and who wouldn't get a dime, I didn't feel rage or bitterness. I felt clarity. Because she had no idea she was delivering her final performance on a stage I paid for. And the knife I held? It wasn't for stabbing. It was for cutting the last thread between us, the one that had always made me feel smaller in her shadow, the one I didn't even realize I'd still been dragging behind me like a chain. I smiled. And I waited for the final act. There are moments in life when silence is louder than any applause, heavier than any confrontation, more surgical than any shouted accusation, and what happened after my mother delivered that perfectly rehearsed line, the one she likely practiced in front of her antique vanity for weeks, the one she'd build up in her head as the final word on a daughter she'd always believed would grow into either an obedient version of herself or a ghost, was exactly that kind of moment. Thick, glacial, devastatingly quiet, and more profound than anything she could have possibly anticipated. And while the room around us stirred awkwardly, caught somewhere between confusion and secondhand embarrassment, I just smiled, not out of spite or satisfaction, but because the gravity of what was happening had already passed through me hours earlier when I'd sat in the back corner of the venue, signing off on the final transfer of a property that would, within a year, become part of the very portfolio that would dismantle everything she thought she was leaving behind. The pause that followed my words, "That's fine. I bought the company that paid for this venue," didn't last more than a few seconds in real time, but it stretched into something timeless in her face, a flicker of confusion, quickly masked by control, a barely perceptible contraction in her jaw, followed by the ever-calculating shift behind her eyes that meant she was already analyzing what this meant, how it looked, who heard it, and how quickly she could minimize the damage. But damage control doesn't work when the floor's already been pulled out from under you, and the thing you didn't even realize was supporting you is no longer yours. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like her daughter. I felt like her equal, maybe even her consequence. I didn't linger. I didn't need to. I left the way I had arrived, calm, unbothered, practically invisible, because I wanted her to know, without me having to say it, that I no longer needed her attention, her validation, or even her outrage. I didn't want a scene. I wanted understanding not just from her, but from everyone watching, everyone who had spent years treating me like the family footnote, like the daughter who never really fit the mold, like the one who chose a different path. and therefore forfeited any claim to pride or legacy or even a basic acknowledgement at the dinner table. I walked out, and the air outside was warm in that fake New York way, where the buildings trap the heat and reflect it back at you like an accusation. I could still hear the murmur of the crowd behind me, the speculation, the hushed voices, the people doing the math, remembering the company name printed on the napkins, realizing the venue was operated by a group that had recently changed hands, connecting dots they never knew existed. I didn't care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. I'd spent my whole life being underestimated. Now they could spend the rest of theirs trying to catch up. But the truth is, I hadn't done any of this for applause, and I sure as hell hadn't done it just to wound her, because wounds heal, and she would have spun it as a scratch. No, I had done it to sever something that had been rotting for decades, something that had passed itself off as love, but was really control wrapped in silk, conditional affection laced with performance metrics. I needed her to understand, in the one language she actually respected, power, that she didn't get to write the final paragraph on who I was, and that legacies are not inherited like jewelry or property or family recipes. They're built, earned, protected. And sometimes, they're stolen back by the ones you tried to erase. And yet, for all my planning, all the layers of preparation and silent maneuvering, nothing prepared me for what I found a few days later when a small brown envelope arrived at my office, hand-delivered by a courier who didn't know who had sent it, only that it was prepaid and marked personal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not typed, but written in the tight, controlled script I'd seen in every one of her annotations growing up. No greeting. No signature. Just 4 lines. You think you took something from me. You think I didn't see you coming. But I knew long before you ever did. And I let it happen anyway. I stared at those words for what felt like hours, not because I didn't understand them, but because I did. It was her final play, the kind of twisted, circular logic she'd always excelled at. She couldn't admit defeat, not even now. So instead, she rebranded it. She made it hers. As if my success had only ever been a part of her master plan, as if I was merely another investment she'd allowed to mature. I should have laughed. I should have thrown it out. But I folded the note neatly, placed it in my desk drawer, and locked it. Because that's the thing about people like her, they don't ever lose. Not publicly. Not permanently. They just rewrite the terms until even their collapse looks like a handoff. But I didn't need her to admit anything anymore. I didn't need a headline or a trophy or even an acknowledgement. What I had, what she couldn't touch, couldn't spin, couldn't strip from me, was control. Of my story. Of my legacy. Of every room I walked into moving forward. I had built something that didn't need her name stamped on it to matter. And yet, as I sat there alone in my office, surrounded by walls I'd paid for with my own sweat and silence, I couldn't help but wonder, just for a second, if I had become more like her than I'd ever wanted to be. Strategic. Cold. Patient. Willing to wait 10 years for a single, calculated blow. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was awareness. The terrifying realization that sometimes, in order to free yourself from someone, you have to become the thing they were never prepared to face. So no, I didn't get a dime. But I took the foundation. And I left her with the shell.